Thank you very much. My remarks today in part abridge, condense, and supplement what the Cornwall Alliance has said in a 76-page interdisciplinary research paper that we published last December called A Renewed Call to Truth, Prudence, and Protection of the Poor, an Evangelical Examination of the Theology, Science, and Economics of Global Warming, the product of nearly 30 leading evangelical theologians, scientists, and economists. I invite you to read the whole paper at our website, cornwallalliance.org. However, in light of the comments earlier in this conference by Joe Bast, who referred to Mike Hume's 4 myths common to environmentalism, I revised this talk last night to focus on an issue that I believe is fundamentally important to the worldwide discussion of climate change, an issue that we must understand if we are to hope to resolve the intellectual, political, and values conflicts that so polarize our society. So after a very brief summary of our findings in A Renewed Call to Truth, I shall turn to a discussion that properly addresses the philosophy and even somewhat the theology of science. The world is in the grip of an idea that burning fossil fuels to provide cheap, abundant energy is causing global warming that will be so dangerous that that we must stop it by reducing our use of fossil fuels, no matter the cost. Is that idea true? Well, we believe not. Our examination of the theology, worldview, and ethics, led by Dr. Craig Mitchell, theologian and assistant professor of ethics at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and here attending this conference, finds that global warming alarmism wrongly views the Earth and its ecosystems as the fragile product of chance, not the robust, resilient, self-regulating, and self-correcting product of God's wise design and powerful sustaining. It both rests on and promotes a view of human beings as alien threats to Earth's flourishing, principally consumers and polluters rather than producers and stewards, the bearers of God's image, crowned with glory and honor, and given a mandate to act as stewards over the earth, filling, subduing, and ruling it for God's glory and mankind's benefit. It wrongly assumes that the environment can flourish only if humanity forfeits economic advance and prosperity. And in its rush to impose draconian reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, it ignores the destructive impact of that policy on the world's poor. Excuse me just a minute. I'm sorry. The providence and promises of God inform a Christian understanding of creation stewardship, helping to avert irrational or exaggerated fears of catastrophes, fears that are rooted ultimately in the loss of faith in God and in an exaggerated sense of human power to effect comprehensive transformations of the fundamental physical systems of the planet. Those who do not trust God are able to those who do trust God are able to assess and respond to risks rationally. God's wisdom, power, and faithfulness justify confidence that Earth's ecosystems are robust and will, by God's providence, accomplish the purposes He set for them. Policies intended to reduce global warming by reducing the use of fossil fuels, currently the most abundant and affordable alternatives to dirty fuels like wood and dung, which are now used by 2 billion people and cause millions of deaths and hundreds of millions of illnesses from respiratory diseases contracted by breathing their smoke, would hurt the world's poor. Insisting on the use of more expensive alternative fuels because of global warming fears means depriving the poor of the abundant, affordable energy they need to rise from abject poverty and its attendant miseries. Such policies fail both moral and prudential tests. Our examination of the science of global warming, led by Dr. Roy Spencer, Principal Research Scientist in Climatology at the University of Alabama, Huntsville, lead scientist on NASA's Aqua Satellite Remote Sensing Project, as well as a plenary speaker for this conference, finds that global warming alarmism wrongly claims that recent temperature changes have been greater and more rapid than those of the past and therefore must be man-made, not natural. It exaggerates the influence of man-made greenhouse gases on global temperature and ignores or underestimates the influence of natural cycles, particularly the influence of ocean current cycles on cloud formation, and it confuses cloud feedback with cloud forcing, reversing cause and effect. Earth's climate is less sensitive to the addition of CO2 than the scientific consensus claims it to be, which means that climate model predictions of future warming are exaggerated. Specifically on cloud formation, Specifically, instead of a likely 3 °C increase in global average temperature from doubled effective atmospheric CO2 concentration, a result that would require strongly positive net feedbacks, we believe the best empirical research on feedbacks shows them to be strongly net negative, eliminating about 58% of greenhouse warming, resulting in only about ½ of warming from doubled CO2. AGW alarmism mistakenly takes the output of computer climate models as evidence when it is only predictions based on hypotheses that must be tested by observation. It falsely claims overwhelming scientific consensus in favor of the hypothesis of dangerous man-made warming, and then falsely claims that such consensus, if it existed, would prove the hypothesis and justify policies to fight it. It seeks to intimidate or demonize scientific skeptics rather than welcoming their work as of the very essence of scientific inquiry, putting hypotheses to the test. In contrast to AGW alarmism, we believe that, given that CO2 in the atmosphere is necessary for life on Earth to exist, and that every doubling of its concentration yields an average 35% increase in plant growth efficiency, more CO2 will be beneficial. Now, this is rarely discussed because many environmental activists share the quasi-religious belief that everything mankind does hurts the environment. Our examination of the economics of global warming alarmism, led by Dr. G. Cornelis van Kooten, professor of economics and research chair in environmental studies and climate at the University of Victoria, finds that it exaggerates the harms from global warming and ignores or underestimates the benefits not only from warming but also from increased atmospheric CO2. It grossly underestimates the costs and overestimates the benefits of policies meant to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. It exaggerates the technical feasibility, primarily by ignoring the basic physics of power density and energy density, and underestimates the costs of alternative fuels to replace fossil fuels and providing the abundant, affordable energy necessary for wealth creation and poverty reduction. It ignores the urgent need to provide cleaner energy to the roughly 2 billion poor in the world whose use of wood and dung as primary cooking and heating fuels causes millions of premature deaths and hundreds of millions of debilitating respiratory diseases every year. It fails to recognize that the slowed economic development resulting from its policies will cost many times more human lives than would the warming it's meant to avert, even assuming that the predicted warming comes about. Now, let me expand just a little bit on the problem of renewables. Granting the basic physics of energy sources, the likelihood that renewables will ever replace fossil fuels and nuclear is slim to vanishing. As energy expert Robert Bryce points out in his newly published book, Power Hungry: The Myths of Green Energy and the Real Fuels of the Future, every energy source must be judged in terms of 4 imperatives: power density, energy density, scale, and cost. Time permits me to comment only on the first, power density, the energy flow that can be harnessed from a given unit of volume, area, or mass. The power density of an oil well producing only about 10 barrels per day, or of a marginal natural gas well, is about 27 or 28 watts per meter squared, respectively. And of a nuclear power plant like the South Texas project, even accounting for the full 19 square miles of its site, not the much smaller power plant itself, is about 56 watts per meter squared. But the power density of corn ethanol is about 0.05 watts per meter squared. Of wind, at best 1.2, and of solar, at best 6.7. And wind and solar are also intermittent. Simple math shows that a marginal gas or oil well has a power density at least 22 times that of a wind turbine, while a nuclear power plant has a power density that is more than 8 times that of a solar PV facility. This fundamental bit of physics implies that renewables will necessarily also fail to meet the standards of fossil fuels and nuclear in the other 3 imperatives: energy density, scale, and cost. Well, in light of all of these and many more considerations, theological, scientific, and economic, discussed in the full paper, the Cornwall Alliance recommends against mandated reductions in CO2 emissions and for the promotion of economic development and targeted problem solving. For example, disease reduction and nutrition enhancement as a means to fortify people the world over, especially the poor, against material threats to their well-being, whether from climate change or anything else. On the basis of this document, the Cornwall Alliance has issued an evangelical declaration on global warming, which was endorsed by over 500 people within just over a month after its release in December, including over 150 prominent evangelical theologians, pastors, ministry leaders, scientists, and economists. I would invite you to join in endorsing that declaration, which you can do at cornwallalliance.org, or my colleague Kena Gonzalez has paper copies of it here and at our exhibit in the exhibit hall. But now I want to turn to the underlying problem, the revolt against reason. Sunday evening, Joe Bast referred briefly to what Mike Hume, founding director of the Tyndall Center and professor of climate change, note that title, by the way, not of climate, but of climate change, at the University of East Anglia, home of the Climate Research Unit of ClimateGate infamy, called 4 myths common to environmentalism: lamenting Eden, presaging apocalypse, reconstructing Babel, that is, promoting technology as the solution to all problems, and celebrating Jubilee. Keep in mind that Hume mentored Phil Jones and many other leading climate scientists. Now, don't let Hume's calling these myths mislead you. He doesn't mean to denigrate them as false. He means to highlight their culture-shaping power, whether true or false. Lamenting Eden is the tendency of environmentalists to hark back to a golden age, an age before humanity transgressed its bounds and began to harm the perfect paradise that was the earth. Presaging apocalypse is their tendency to look forward, sometimes with fear, but sometimes with ghoulish delight, to the time when the offended Gaia will take its revenge on humanity through ecological collapse. Reconstructing Babel is what environmentalists accuse humanity of doing through the development of technology and urbanization. And celebrating Jubilee is their pursuit of eco-justice, which is code speak, just like social justice, for wealth redistribution to achieve the equality of wealth that all people are due. It is immediately clear that these are all religious elements, reflecting but twisting the biblical heritage right down to the mistaken appeal to the Jubilee, which in Leviticus chapter 25 did not require redistribution of wealth, but the return of what was effectively productive collateral for a loan when it was paid off. It's important to note that Hume, a scientist, promotes these religious ideas in the name of environmental science. Now, Joe Bast's reference to Hume's 4 myths speaks particularly to me. Understand that while I've read scores of books and thousands of articles on climate change, I am foremost a theologian, philosopher, historian, economist. And this kind of thing is my red meat, or for the vegetarians among you, my soy meal. I could analyze and refute each of these from a biblical Christian perspective, but for time's sake, I want to go to the root of Hume's migration from science to pseudo-religion. It is said to be found in his commitment to something called post-normal science, about which a question was asked during our breakfast session this morning. The quick answer given there referred to Stephen Schneider's well-known willingness to exaggerate to motivate action. But post-normal science goes far beyond that. It is a philosophically sophisticated and epistemological construct and must not be underestimated. Until we understand its influence in the AGW alarmist community, climate realists and climate scientists will continue talking past each other, and the public will continue just to be confused. It cannot have been lost on many climate realist scientists that the debate over the science of climate change has been characterized by some strange tactics, such as demonization of dissent, distrust of attempts at replication, rejection of openness and data sharing, and appeal to consensus. As ClimateGate and other transgressions of fundamental scientific procedure by global warming alarmists continue to unfold, it becomes increasingly clear that a great deal of what's been called climate science isn't science at all. It's ideological propaganda, often religious, but certainly not biblical, masquerading as science. In a blog post last November titled "Climate Change and the Death of Science," before ClimateGate broke into the news, British blogger Kevin McGrain demonstrated from their own words that some key climate scientists, climate alarmists, knew and admitted that they were no longer doing science but politics. McGrain explained how science got hijacked by post-normal science along the hurried way to the overwhelming scientific consensus on man-made global warming. He pointed out that Hume is himself a devotee of post-normal science, a proponent of it along with Oxford philosopher of science Jerome Ravitz, and therefore a traitor to real science. McGrain quoted Eva Kunstler, herself an advocate of post-normal science, and therefore not to be suspected of presenting it in a bad light, as distinguishing normal science from post-normal science this way. Normal science, she says, is a logic-inductive process leading to theory formulation while all the way put through critical tests that have been deductively derived from the theory. Popper's critical rationalist concept of science is an objective progression toward the truth. The term normal science refers to the routine work of scientists within a paradigm, slowly accumulating knowledge in accord with established theoretical assumptions. The paradigm is enlarged and frontiers of knowledge and techniques pushed forward. The exercise of scholarly activities is defined by the dominance of kudos, C-U-D-O-S, communalism, the common ownership of scientific information, universalism, according to which all truths are to be evaluated in terms of universal or value-free criteria, disinterestedness, and organized skepticism. And then she defines post-normal science this way. A new concept of science was introduced by Funtovich and Ravitz during the 1990s. It was actually about 10 years earlier. The concept of post-normal science goes beyond the traditional assumptions that science is both certain and value-free. The exercise of scholarly activities is defined by the dominance of goal orientation, where scientific goals are controlled by political or societal actors. Scientists' integrity lies not in disinterestedness, but in their behavior as stakeholders. Normal science made the world believe that scientists should and could provide certain objective factual information. The guiding principle of normal science, the goal of achievement of factual knowledge, must be modified to fit the post-normal principle. For this purpose, post-normal scientists should be capable of establishing extended peer communities and allow for extended facts from non-scientific experts. In post-normal science, the maintenance and enhancement of quality rather than the establishment of factual knowledge is the key task of scientists. Involved social actors must agree on the definition of perceptions, narratives, interpretation of models, data, and indicators. Scientists have to contribute to society by learning as quickly as possible about different perceptions instead of seeking deep, ultimate knowledge. Now, I could go on to give you a bunch of quotations from Mike Hume in his book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change. But what it all boils down to is this fundamental thing. A lot of the key AGW alarmists are post-normalists, and the realists are real scientists. That's the reason. And until realist scientists both grasp that and begin to communicate it effectively to the public, The conversation will continue as ships passing in the night, and the public will just be confused. Therefore, one of our great policy goals must be the communication of the corruption, indeed the replacement of real science with post-normal science. Thank you.